For this lecture, I'm going to talk about chapter 6 of Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography. And this chapter is titled A Tragedy. This chapter actually comes in two parts, with chapter 6 being called A Tragedy and chapter 7 being called A Tragedy Continued. Right? So these two chapters together, um, they combine to form, you may say, one larger narrative, one chapter, one larger chapter, if you may. So without further ado, I'm just going to start with the excerpts, and we're going to look at some of the most important excerpts in relation to the incidents that are to be narrated in this text. So Gandhi begins saying, "My mother, my eldest brother, and my wife warned me that I was in bad company. I was too proud to heed my wife's warning." Now, we have already seen previously that the patriarchal notions, or the patriarchal ideas of what should be the behavior of a husband and how the wife should behave like, these were something which were ingrained in Gandhi, and he had also learned some of that stuff from reading those local booklets. And so he had that idea, and he confesses his own wrongdoing in his autobiography towards his wrongdoing towards his wife, um, as he tried to be an authoritative husband. Now, this authoritative nature of the husband, of Gandhi playing the role of the husband, was not just limited to how he behaves towards her. It was also how, it also affected how he paid attention to what she said, or to what extent he took her advice. Now, this becomes clear when we look at the first excerpt from this chapter. Note that he says, "My mother, my eldest brother, and my wife warned me that I was in bad company. I was too proud to heed my wife's warning." Right? So, um, just just as the narrative was built up in the previous chapters, that is the narrative of Gandhi playing the authoritative husband. So here, that reaches a sort of culmination. A reformer cannot afford to have close intimacy with him whom he seeks to reform. Friends react on one another, hence, in friendship, there is very little scope for reform. Now, this chapter is titled A Tragedy, and as you will soon realize, the tragedy is about uh, meat eating. Meat eating is what the tragedy is here. Meat eating is called the tragedy. And Gandhi was a vegetarian from a vegetarian family where almost everyone was vegetarian. And I told you in one of the early lectures that um one of the objections that Gandhi's relatives had to Gandhi going to England to study law was that in England he wouldn't be able to practice Hinduism, right? So now, what does it mean when Gandhi's relatives say that Gandhi won't be able to practice Hinduism in England? So one of the reasons would be the conflict that arises from the food practices in England, right? So Gandhi was from a certain kind of society which was strictly vegetarian, and England, of course, was its opposite. And so that became a matter of conflict, but obviously, as you know, Gandhi did go to England. So that meat eating becomes the locus of chapter 6, the a tragedy. And in context of meat eating, now obviously a vegetarian boy from a family which is predominantly vegetarian, he does not come across meat all of a sudden, right? And this meat eating, he is introduced to meat eating by another friend, and it is this friend who is referred to as bad company in the very first excerpt. Right? Now the friend is not named anywhere in the chapter, but let's see what happens, how things unfold. This friend informed me that many of our teachers were secretly taking meat and wine. He also named many well-known people of Rajkot as belonging to the same company. There were also, I was told, some high school boys among them, right? So you surely know the context. British colonial rule is at its peak during this time, and the region where Gandhi is from is mostly vegetarian, um, and that remains to be the case today, right? So it was similar back then, and meat eating was not the norm, right? In fact, meat eating was looked down upon. So that was the case, and one of Gandhi's friends at that time, who his family had warned him against, his family meaning his wife, his mother, and his eldest brother, had warned him against this friend, saying that this friend is not good company, stay away from him. But as he already said, he didn't pay attention to his mother and eldest brother. In fact, if you read the chapter closely, you will find that Gandhi, offered arguments that I want to reform this friend. Maybe this friend is not so good, but yes, I am confident that I will be able to reform him and make him a better person. That was his kind of argument, and his mother and eldest brother, despite not being convinced by his argumentations, nonetheless reluctantly agreed to allow Gandhi to continue his friendship. But of course, as you know, he did not pay heed to his wife's warnings, which were also the same warning that the company is not good. But then again, as he confesses, he was too proud to heed to her warning. Now, this friend, who remains unnamed, informed Gandhi that many people around were secretly consuming meat and wine, and many well-known people were also involved. Now, as you know, as you can surely understand, that this friend was trying to induce a certain kind of habit. So he was, um, trying to tell Gandhi that there are people who are doing this, so it won't be wrong for you to do, right? He's just trying to get Gandhi to buy his argument. Now, to what extent what his friend was saying is true, we have no option to verify. We have no, we do not have any historical evidence here, not provided by Gandhi, of course. So let's see what Gandhi says. Uh, this is in response to what his friend told him, that a lot of people, including high school boys and a lot of well known people and a lot of teachers of their school, had been eating meat and wine. So Gandhi says, I was surprised and pained. I asked my father the reason, and he explained it does. Sorry, I misspoke. I asked my friend the reason, and he explained it thus: we are a weak people because we do not eat meat. The English are able to rule over us because they are meat eaters. Now, for Gandhi, who was certainly aware of British rule, this argument seemed to make sense. Let's go ahead and see to what extent he is convinced. All these pleas on behalf of meat eating were not advanced at a single sitting. They represent the substance of a long and elaborate argument which my friend was trying to impress upon me from time to time. So, as you see, his friend did not, it was not like one fine morning, Gandhi left his home, met his friend, and his friend was like, "Hey, all the people, many of the people I know are eating meat, including our teachers, some high school boys, and some well-known people. Why don't you try?" And Gandhi tried. It's not like that, right? So his friend, this quote unquote bad company, this person, he tried to convince Gandhi to consume meat over a long period of time, right? So over several sittings, as Gandhi says, not advanced. All these pleas on behalf of meat eating were not advanced at a single sitting, right? So he was constantly trying to impress upon Gandhi that meat eating would actually be a virtue because the English are able to rule over us because they consume meat and we don't. Now, Gandhi says his elder brother had already fallen. He therefore supported my friend's argument. Now, his elder brother already eating meat, probably convinced by this fellow too, and he was already eating meat, and so naturally he took his friend's side and argued in favor of meat eating. Now, let's see how Gandhi reacted to all this, all this convincing that his friend was trying to do here. He says, I certainly looked feeble bodied by the side of my brother and this friend. They were both hardier, physically stronger, and more daring. This friend's exploits cast a spell over me. I was dazzled by this friend's exploits. This was followed by a strong desire to be like him. I could hardly jump or run. Why should I um, not also be as strong as he? So you see, Gandhi seems quite convinced, right? So this argument in favor of, rather arguments in favor of meat eating, which this friend had been trying to induce through multiple sittings, multiple conversations where he was arguing in favor of meat eating, and he had repeatedly argued. One of the core arguments seems to have been the fact that the English people eat meat, they are stronger and are easily able to rule over us who are weaker because we do not eat meat. Nonetheless, it seems Gandhi is quite impressed by this argument, and whether he has decided to eat meat, we will see in the next slide. So he says, moreover, I was a coward, right? So he's trying to argue within himself. He has been told by his friend and also his own elder brother, who has already kind of submitted to meat eating, kind of fallen, as Gandhi treats in this chapter. So uh, yeah, Gandhi is trying to argue within himself, with himself, as to whether he will be able to consume meat. And already you have seen some of his arguments. He's weaker than his friends, his brother. He cannot jump. So why not try and be stronger, right? So that was one argument. The previous argument was, of course, British rule. Let's see what other arguments are there in favor of meat eating. This is, remember, this is a conversation or conversations that Gandhi is having with himself, trying to decide for himself after getting all those impressions from his friend as to whether he should consume meat or not. So he says, moreover, I was a coward. I used to be haunted by the fear of thieves, ghosts, and serpents. I did not dare to stir out of doors at night. Darkness was a terror to me. It was almost impossible for me to sleep in the dark, as I would imagine ghosts coming from one direction, thieves from another, and serpents from a third. I could not, therefore, bear to sleep without a light in the room. Right? So Gandhi, he has been providing his reasons for falling to kind of eating meat, because Gandhi, from the moral perspective, he sees meat eating as a sort of fallenness, something, if you consume, you are no more in the state of being you used to be, and the moment you consume meat, you are sort of a fallen person, right? So that is the kind of aversion he has to meat eating. And now, after his friend has provided so many arguments in favor, he then introspects, and upon introspection, he finds that I'm really cowardish, and being cowardish, I'm afraid of ghosts and thieves and all sorts of things that I imagine are going to haunt me, and I can't even bear to sleep without a light in my room. So let's see how this fear goes further. How this, you know, a fear which ultimately results in him consuming meat. He says, how could I disclose my fears to my wife? No child, but already at the threshold of youth, sleeping by my side. I knew that she had more courage than I, and I felt ashamed of myself. She knew no fear of serpents and ghosts. She could go anywhere. She could go out anywhere in the dark. So you see, so his wife becomes another reason, right? Even though his wife was the one who had argued that this friend is bad company, and he was too proud to listen to her. However, you have to notice, because it's very significant. He's an authoritative husband, and he cannot also bear the thought of himself being um, cowardly when his wife is uh, does not share his fears. She does not know fear of serpents and ghosts, and she could go out anywhere in the dark. So kind of Mahatma Gandhi started feeling inferior, right? And obviously, as we have seen in the previous instances from his youth, he could not bear with that thought. Okay, further, let's see more argumentations, several more arguments. A doggerel of the Gujarati poet Narmada was in vogue amongst us schoolboys as follows. A doggerel is a poem, is a short poem, and the poem is quoted here. Behold the mighty Englishman, he rules the Indian small, because being a meat eater, he is 5 cubits tall. Right? So you see more and more arguments in favor. First of all, he is weak as compared to his friends and brother. Second, he is very cowardly, and his own wife is, braver than he is. Um, so he could not bear with that thought. And then again, there is the third big reason, wherein the Englishman who eats meat is mighty and tall and powerful, and can easily rule upon non-meat eaters. All this had its due effect on me, he says. I was beaten. I began to grow on me that meat eating was good, that it would make me strong and daring, and that if the whole country took to meat eating, the English could be overcome. I don't think there's much explanation required. It's pretty much self-explanatory. So it's basically an argument which has been building up for some time now, that at this point, it appeared to Gandhi that if meat eating was the sole reason for the English people uh, being stronger and mightier, and being able to rule over such a large country with millions of people, with only a few representatives, right? Because the British were never in India in nearly as much numbers as Indians always lived here. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, if there were 300 million Indians, it wasn't like there were 300 million British people trying to rule Indians in India. There were maybe, I don't know, 1 million. I do not know the exact number, of course, but I'm just trying to tell you that there were much fewer Englishmen or Britishers in India than there were Indians. But even then, the British managed to rule. So Gandhi argued that if meat eating is the reason, then the entire country should start eating meat, and that would result, he hoped, in overcoming the British. So finally, the last excerpt from this chapter. The opposition to and abhorrence of meat eating that existed in Gujarat among the Jains and Vaishnavas were to be seen nowhere else in India or outside in such strength. There were the traditions in which I was born and bred. So now the counter argument. For the last three slides, Gandhi has been providing arguments in favor of eating meat. And now, after providing so many arguments, from being weak to uh, being cowardly, his wife being more courageous than he is, and his assumption that meat eating is probably the cause why British are able to rule over Indians. So these were all the reasons in favor. Now he's trying to, as I said, he's arguing with himself. He's trying to provide counter reasons, and he says that the opposition to and abhorrence to meat eating existed in Gujarat for a very long time, and not only did it exist there, it existed in such strength that exists nowhere else in India, right? And I believe, from what I gather, what I read, I believe this continues to be true today, right? Because standing, dealing with such a topic uh, from a state which is far from Gujarat, obviously the habits, of food traditions of people are different, right? And Gujarat, it apparently definitely has a stronger tradition of vegetarianism, right? So that was one of the counter arguments that Gandhi had, because uh, that too he wanted to protect, right? The tradition of Vaishnavism, Jainism, which was so strongly present in Gujarat. It was not a question of, it was not a question of pleasing the palate. I did not know that it had a particularly good relish. I wished to be strong and daring and wanted my countrymen also to be such, so that we might defeat the English and make India free. The word Swaraj I not yet heard. I had not yet heard, I guess. But I knew what freedom meant. The frenzy of the reform blinded me. So now, after so much argumentation in favor and against, after debating with himself, after debating both for and against meat eating, Gandhi seems to have come to a conclusion at the end of this chapter. And uh, um, the conclusion is actually a hint. The frenzy of the reform blinded me. And when he says blinded me, you can guess that, okay, he has finally agreed to eat meat, right? So he says that it was meat eating, the idea of meat eating to his mind was not about taste. It was not a question of pleasing the palate. Palate is obviously a reference to his taste buds. So he said that I did not, have any particular wish or particular hope that meat would taste very good, that it would, be of particularly good relish, as he says. But he was under the impression that it would make him stronger and more daring, and he wished that his countrymen would also be strong. And because there was this frenzy of reform, he was blinded by that, right? And as you may have guessed, he does fall for this meat eating. And but that does not entirely explain, or in fact that doesn't even give us a hint as to why this chapter is titled tragedy. Perhaps the only hint we have is the fact that his family was vegetarian, his culture, obviously in reference to geography, and his religious leanings, his family's religious leanings, all of those bringing together. Obviously, there was a tradition of vegetarianism, but there was also all this argumentation that was going on. So, tragedy in that sense is not clear enough from this chapter. But like I told you, the chapter that follows, chapter 7, is titled A Tragedy Continued, right? So, in other words, it's a continuation of this chapter. Now, I'm going to end this discussion today giving you a hint of why this chapter has been titled A Tragedy. Because, as you'll find out in the next chapter, this entire, event from beginning to end, the event of Gandhi arguing and then finally eating meat, is seen as a sin. Gandhi himself retrospectively sees the fact that he had eaten meat as a sin. So that is why it's a tragedy. So we end here. Uh, the next the next lesson will be on the continuation of this chapter.